In this episode of Brad Lackey, The Big Interview, Brad talks about winning in America, moving to Europe, and the crazy stories about developing bikes on the GP circuit.
And everybody can't remember shit now.
I know, exactly. Well, I certainly can't.
One year I finally just took the shock off and threw a bunch of gas on it and threw a match on it, blew it up right in front of the guy and said, "It's hot now." Yeah, we broke more bikes than we finished with them, back then. And on the 500, I just don't remember.
No, it's all getting hot, foggy.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
Because nobody's done this.
I know, and everybody can't remember shit now.
I know, exactly. Well, I certainly can't. So anyway, the point of the book, as I said, originally was just going to be 80 through 86, and talking about it, because everybody reminisces about how it was kind of such a golden era. It was like,
Right.
oh, it was so good.
I mean, 70s was the golden era.
Yeah. Well, what for you at least, what made it a golden era?
I mean, it was for the bike manufacturers and just in general. I mean, that's when everybody started riding motorcycles in America. The Europeans started coming over at late '60s, and we got to see them, and that just sparked a motocross revolution over here. And then manufacturers were starting to import all kinds of bikes, and the Japanese were building new prototype motocross bikes. And so everything kind of hit at the same time. It was right in that beginning of 1970, so that 70s, the suspension revolution started in like 74, 5, and so you went through that whole thing. The monoshock came out by the end of the 70s, the Unitracks and the one shock bike. So from 1970 to 1980, that's when all the changes were made and all the developments. The Simon's forks were right around in that time too. So everything that's really changed, the big changes, was at that time. Since then, the bikes are basically the same. They add some power control valves or something, on the motors, but suspension-wise and shock-wise, everything's kind of basically the same. In '82, we had about the same travel as they have today. So, and that's, even that hasn't changed.
Yeah. So for you, how did this all start for you? When did you, why, how, and when did you start riding?
I started riding on a little Honda when I was, probably 9 or so, out in the hills in Northern California. When my dad had a BSA, and he'd go riding with his buddies, and so while he was off in the big hills, he'd let us kind of ride around in the parking area to learn how to ride and stuff. And then I got a Hodaka, and by 13, I think I won my first race. It was just kind of a field meet type event put on by the local dealer and our local motorcycle club. Actually, it was in the parking lot of the police station. It was, kind of a, like I said, trials thing. You had to do certain tricks and, stay on the bike and all that kind of stuff. And from there, we started, we had races right in at our clubhouse at our local track, and we used to go watch those, and then pretty soon I was, okay, buy me a bike to race that, so just start locally like everybody does. And so that was mid to late 60s, and by 68, 9, I was getting factory rides with Montesa or American Eagle, and 70 on the CZs, and then from there, 72, I was national champ on the Kawasaki.
That was a big leap you made right there. There was a lot of detail missing in the middle of that. You went from a Hodaka to a national championship. I mean, that was obviously a huge progression. What kind of propelled you from the kid riding around with your dad and his BSA to suddenly being the national champion?
I think when Joel and the Europeans came over, and I got to watch him ride at the big races around here in Northern California. They had one at China Camp, which was in San Rafael, which was, just 20 minutes from where we lived, and then down to Santa Cruz and Salinas and some other places. So watching those guys, and at that time I'd ride the support class at those races because they were the biggest races, so I ride a Montesa in one, and I actually rode for Sachs also at that time. I rode a Sachs 125 in one of the 250 races and actually won it at a support race at an NRAM. And watching how good they were and how much faster they were than us, that kind of stuck with me, and I wanted to learn as much as I could so I could be as fast as the Europeans, because no Americans were. So I wanted to set myself apart from the Americans. Instead of riding American speed, I wanted to ride European speed. And so that kind of got me on a path to training more and going to Europe and learning the ropes a little bit.
Well, step back a bit though, because in talking to, David Bailey and some of those guys from a slightly later era, everybody goes, well, yeah, so-and-so was my hero, and I would practice with him, I practiced with Marty Smith or whatever. Who were you riding with at the time that helped you, or was this just all self-propelled stuff? I mean, did somebody help you move on there?
Dick Mann was really the only guy that was more like a mentor, not helping me on a daily basis, but a guy that was faster. And he lived in Richmond where we live, so I had a good guy to gauge off of there, and I was really the only guy. And, we'd race occasionally together, but we'd go out and ride in the hills more often than race together, and, learn a lot of stuff doing that. And other than him, that was it. There was no, I didn't have any Marty Smith guys, around here.
So how did you gauge how well you were doing training-wise, riding-wise? I mean, how did you feel?
Well, if you can beat everybody in your area, then obviously you're fastest in that area. But then you have to go to areas where, there are, that the riders are maybe faster, or they know the tracks better. So we would load up the truck and drive to Southern California, 6-8 hours every weekend for the big races, and race against the earlier Marty Smith guys, let's see who were we racing against. Well, it was Jim O'Neill, and Tripes was there, and Bailey, and Jim Wilson, and a lot of those original Pioneer guys, DeSoto and Nelson, and if we could go down there and win those races against those guys, then that pretty much gave me a gauge of where I was. And we used to do that quite often, just go to LA and win and then come back home. And that kind of showed me that, okay, now I'm as fastest guy in California maybe, and that, you go that way. And there's a good story about like that too. Pomeroy, he was a guy from the north up in Washington area, and he was the fastest guy there on his local track, and then probably all of Washington. So they were trying to gauge how he was compared to the rest of us, and I was winning most of the races in California. So they made me an offer to come up there and ride Jim's track against him, but they didn't tell me that was the deal. They just said, hey, you want to come up and ride this race? We'll give you $400 and pay your gas and la la la. So I'm sure, that sounds like a good thing, a new track and getting paid, and that's what your whole job is, to get paid to race the motorcycle, and that's early forms of payment. And so I went up there, and Jimmy was obviously really good, and it was his home track, and it was a sand track, so he was a sand guy basically. And I didn't have a lot of experience on sand, being here from California. I was a mud guy and hard guy, or mostly mud and good ground. Down in LA it was hard, so I didn't like it that much, but we could put up with it. So anyway, we get up there, and me and Jimmy race in this big race, great duel, and I end up beating him. And then they tell me, well, the reason we brought you up was because we wanted to see how fast our boy was against you, because you're winning the races in California, and he's the fastest guy up here by far. I said, yeah, well, that's a good example of what you need to do. I said, now you need to ship him down to California and get him out of here so he can learn some more and get faster. And that's what they did. And Jimmy started coming to California, and he stayed with me, and he started beating everybody in LA too. And then we decided, well, I was going to go to Europe anyway in '73 after I won the national championship here. So I basically talked him into doing it too, so I'd have somebody to play around with over in Europe. And then the rest is history. He went to Spain and won a moto and became the first American to do that. And that was a great time.
So, going back to how everything was changing back then in the late 60s and early 70s, everything was new, everything was experimental basically back then.
Oh yeah.
Against the wall to see what stuck.
Yeah, we broke more bikes than we finished with them, back then.
I talking to Roger the other day, and I said, "So what was the what suddenly made everything better?" He said, "Well, he said when the Japanese came in, we didn't have to listen to all the European manufacturers saying, well, you shouldn't land so hard and you shouldn't jump so far, and everything's breaking." What was that was that what you found too? It was like, they were making excuses for things breaking back then.
Well, I don't think that's solely the European manufacturers. I think everybody does. And, because they test it with their riders in their country, or wherever, say the Swedes with the Husky. I had the same problem with them as a lot of companies. I have a different riding style than Heike. Heike's winning races and I'm not, and I'm throwing chains and breaking bikes. So, obviously I'm riding wrong. I need to ride more like Heike. And when I try to explain to them that's something you can't change, and each rider is unique in his riding style, and nowadays that's just the norm. Guy on a factory team, he doesn't ride the same bike as the other factory rider. That guy's 6 foot tall, this guy's 5'6", and short legs, long legs, different power bands, different suspensions. I mean, if you told somebody nowadays you're riding the same bike as the other guy, they would have a fit, but back then they didn't get it. They thought, okay, we build one bike, everybody rides it, and that's how it works. So, I was always having that problem, but no matter what team you go to, if something breaks, there's a problem and you're doing it wrong, and or the other guy's doesn't break, and so he must be doing it right and you're doing it wrong. So, I finally, I got to the point where I knew the problem on my Husky was that the swing arm was flexing. That's why the chain's falling off, and Heike didn't ride in a way that he made that happen, and I did. So they kept going, "Oh, your mechanic's doing it wrong. He's not adjusting your chain properly." I said, "Okay, have Heike's mechanic fix my chain, and then I'll go out there and I'll watch it fall off." They go, "No, that won't happen." So I go, "Where do you want the chain to fall off?" I'd go over a jump and twist the bike a little bit, chain would fall off, and then they're scratching their heads and they're going, "Not the mechanic, okay. What could it be? It must still be the rider then." "No, the swing arm's flexing." "No, it can't flex. Heike's doesn't fall off." I go, "Okay." So I end up making my own aluminum swing arm, and the chain doesn't fall off anymore. And still the engineers, they can't understand it. So, there's a fight, building and doing R&D on motorcycles and making them good enough for the public and good enough to win races. The rider didn't have an easy time at those years. I don't know about now, but,
Were you actually, was that part of your job to develop motorcycles?
Oh yeah, that was my job. If you happen to win some races, good. But your job is to make the bike better, finish races, not break, so they can build a production bike.
But if they're telling you you're riding it wrong, how are you actually developing a better bike? I don't get that.
Well, some of them, like I said, are very stubborn.
Well, so it was chains flying off, that kind of being the worst thing that ever happened when you were having problems developing bikes?
Oh no, there's a picture right over there with the Kawasaki broke in half, and I remember in the Philadelphia Supercross, Weinert's broke in half, and the people came out of the stands and stole the front end. They were taking it back up into the seats, and they finally caught him and got the half of the bike back. Breaking frames in half, like what happened to Roger at Carnegie in '75. His triple clamps broke. Those are things that, and I don't think after that the Japanese came up to Roger and said, "Hey, you're jumping it too hard." I don't think they said that then. So, there's always DNFs. Like I said, we broke down more than, Nowadays, if a guy breaks down one race, it's headlines, Yeah. Back then, we broke down half the races,
What was the hardest part for you in you're obviously a real motorcycle guy. Some races aren't necessarily real motorcycle guys. What was the hardest part for you in developing those bikes in that kind of fashion? What was?
Well, you get some new innovations, like we worked with Preston Petty a lot, and he made a part, we called it an anti-dive, and it hooked onto the front wheel of the bike and had a bar, and so when you put on the brakes, your forks wouldn't go down. So now you're coming down a big hill and there's giant braking bumps, and you grab the front end and your forks go down. Now you got an inch of travel to go through where the big bumps are. So with his system, Your forks don't go down when you slow down, and now you got 9 inches to go through the bumps. Kind of a no-brainer, right? And, you know, at the time, I was riding Honda, and Honda says, no, you can't have that. We didn't design it. Our engineers didn't do it. Somebody else did it, so you got to take it off. I mean, that's tough to deal with, you know, because you know you have an advantage finally, and it works, and the company won't let you use it. So, you know, when they won't listen to you, won't make changes, you come up with better things, you can't use them. Pretty frustrating.
So that was purely a political decision, not an engineering decision.
Well, you know, I don't know who makes those decisions at the top, but you know, you can see their point. We didn't make it. We don't know if it's going to break or not. Does it give you that much of advantage? You know, they're not riding the bike. They don't know that. You know, so you know, if you have the best company to work for was Kawasaki. They would listen to you. They would make changes. They would let you try stuff, and they put the faith in the rider. Where the other companies, they put it in the hands of people that aren't riding the bike, and that's tough.
Yeah, because I've in talking to other racers, they've all said, oh yeah, well the factory would send over some bike that had 6,000 horsepower on the dyno, and then we get on the racetrack and it was just worthless. I mean, there must have been plenty of those kind of things where they thought it was great, but obviously it wasn't.
Oh yeah, we had, you know, like shocks problems. We had shock problems, you know, the whole time, you know, once the suspension got long and then the shock was getting used a hell of a lot more. And shocks would get hot and fade, and then they wouldn't work, and then you'd lose traction and hit bumps and crash instead of going through them. So, you know, I'd have a shock guy tell me, it can't be fading. We've had it on the dyno this much time, and then it goes that many strokes, and it never gets hot over this temperature. So you're not feeling that. You're feeling something else. I go, no, that's what I'm feeling. You know, I've been doing this long enough. You know, they call it seat of the pants, you know, and that's what it is when you're on a motorcycle. Your butt tells you everything, you know. So after a lot of problems with the shock and losing points in the GPs one year, I finally just took the shock off and threw a bunch of gas on it and threw a match on it and blew it up right in front of the guy and said, it's hot now. And we took my mechanic, lucky I had a good mechanic that was, you know, smart in suspension and stuff, and we took it apart, revalved it ourselves, and won the next Grand Prix. So, you know, sometimes you got to do it yourself.